Hello?
It's live now.
It's live now. Okay, Ana, thank you so much for being with us from your Portuguese wilderness. We have a couple of wilderness involved in this conference. Julieta is also somewhere exotic, but we have to say, as we said it already numerous times, we are quite tropical ourselves here in Austria. In any case, this is the beginning of our second session. And we're going to start with Ana Teixeira Pinto. Ana Teixeira Pinto is a lecturer and writer from Lisbon who currently lives in Berlin. She's also Portuguese wilderness. We have a couple of wilderness. You can. So all the others have to mute their microphones except Ana.
Okay, I hope it's working because I hear people and I cannot.
One second. I'm getting an echo from. Okay, go ahead.
Hello?
Yes.
Is someone there?
We're all here.
Yes, we are here. Please go ahead, Ana. I introduced you with one sentence, but
no problem. Thank you.
Okay.
I cannot see myself. I cannot see anything. Well,
embrace the unknown. You know, the unknown unknowns of our contemporary existence are here for you to be embraced. Go ahead.
Do you see me? Do you see me? Hello?
No, you just turned off your camera. Hold on.
No, I hear you.
No.
Is this on or off?
Now it's on.
Sorry. Okay. I'm gonna try to just like bring a couple of points because I think that like this is complicated. I also know that it's really complicated to focus on what people are saying over Skype when they are not present in the room, and I find it very exhausting to give like full paper presentations. So, I mean, I was also not there, so I'm not aware what the discussion is revolving around, though of course like I read the little abstract. I think that when it comes to the question of art and technology, art and cybernetics, art and artificial intelligence, for me the problem or the limitation, let me put it like that, with all these fields of research, or the way I would phrase my question would be whether in a human society the determining factor of structure formations are or can be said to be internal to the structures themselves, which is what system theory, which is like an offshoot of cybernetics, proposes, or whether actually in a human society the determining factors are always external to the structures themselves, which is how I would frame it. I don't know exactly how you've been framing the discussion so far, so I don't know, so this is a question. Would it make sense for me to go a little bit into the history of cybernetics and explain a little bit what, like how this field emerged and, like what is like the scientific background that gives rise to the theory? Hello?
Yes, I think that would be productive in the framework of the overall discussion we had so far. Go ahead.
Yeah? Okay. Like just to give a little bit of a background, I would say that it's interesting to consider that like energy, that is like one of the capital, or let's say like the fundamental concept in scientific epistemology in the 19th century, always it comes into being already accompanied by its evil twin, which is entropy. And entropy is a little bit, like capitalism response to the idea of energy, because of course, like if you would understand capitalism as a way to always engineer scarcity, then energy, which is like something that in and of itself would be seen as, or intuitively would be seen as limitless, is immediately limited, or immediately comes into being as something that is limited by this kind of like let's say, negative appearance, which is appearance as entropy. And it would be maybe interesting to explain that entropy is for the very first time described by William Thomson, while William Thomson was later Lord Kelvin, or he was later given the title of Lord Kelvin, and so he's better known as Lord Kelvin. But while he was still known as William Thomson, in 1951 he was studying the steam engine's operation in the city of Glasgow. And what he came to the conclusion that in the process of harvesting heat back onto the production cycle, there was always a remainder, and there is always some percentage that could not be converted back into work, so it would be lost for industry. But it was this observation, which seems to be a bit trivial, that led Thomson to conclude that there was a universal tendency for the dissipation of mechanical energy, which he swiftly extrapolated. And the way he formulated it, I quote, was that within a finite period of time past, the Earth must have been, and within a finite period of time to come, the Earth must again be unfit for the habitation of man. Now, this seems to be a little bit, how can I put it? It seems to be like like an over-extrapolation. But, hello?
Yes, we can hear you. We're listening to you. We're here.
You just froze, I think.
Let's hope that Benjamin will. Let's hope that she will come back. Hello, Benjamin.
Hi.
We just lost Anna Pinto, so I hope she gets back. She's kind of like the last moment, like she already knows that she's gone, but like we have this image.
And it's a beautiful one. It's a very nice portrait of Anna, so we can live with it for another couple of minutes at least. But hi Ben, by the way. So we are now. Are we just gonna wait for another couple of minutes? Should we try to do something? Or?
It's hard because she's not on Facebook, so it's hard to message her and see what's going on.
I can message her on the phone.
Yes, see if she can come back. We wait. Otherwise, we go to Benjamin, and then she can just continue. I mean, yeah, that's what Benjamin said, right? Is Benjamin next?
Bassam is next.
I'm just gonna write a short message to Anna to see whether she can reconnect. If she's trying to reconnect.
You have her cell phone, right?
Yeah.
Excellent.
She's not longer.
Actually, this is a good sign. That she's like,
maybe she's restarting everything. Okay.
Done it many times. That's how it works.
Hey, hi Anna. Hi. You're offline. Can you? Are you trying to reconnect or? Okay. Okay. So what we're gonna do? We're gonna then go. Yes. Okay. So since Anna is now going to restart the whole computer and take a little bit of time to do that, maybe we can move on. And since Benjamin is here with us, maybe then we can... Anna? Okay.
You think she'll come back later, or she just gave up?
No, she said that she's trying to restart, but she doesn't know whether it's going to work. She's...
Ask him if he wants to go now. He was expected to go after the sun, right? No. Benjamin's here. Yeah, so maybe we can. You want to ask Benjamin?
Hi, Benjamin. Do you think you could go now instead of Anna because she's having problems with the internet?
We all are.
If it's okay for you, since you're here,
Yeah.
for the economy of time, maybe it would be
sure.
That would be helpful.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
And I'll just go for my regular 15 minutes, so I don't throw everything else off schedule. What I wanted to talk about today, sort of to put on the table, has in terms of this very interesting provocations that Mo and everyone has sent along around algorithms, has to do with risk. And in a way, I guess what I would want to convince people of is that you should all get into insurance. And I'll explain why that's maybe less of a boring path than it might seem. One of my favorite magazines, maybe my favorite magazine actually, is a magazine called Schadenspiegel, which is published by the German enterprise reinsurance professional group. So all of the reinsurance agencies, that is the agencies that insure the insurance companies. So insurance companies, when they take a big loss on a ship goes down or there's a train wreck or earthquake or something, they themselves are insured by the reinsurance industry. So the reinsurance industry has this magazine, Schadenspiegel, which is basically a kind of disaster porn monthly, where it's these lavish, beautiful pictures of all sorts of things, of all kinds of systemic infrastructural mayhem. It looks a bit like the Virilio exhibition at Cartier from some years ago. But in addition to all these great pictures, it also has some amazing, incredibly intelligent and dryly objective articles and stories on climate change, pandemics, food supply problems, water supply problems, and the rest of this. And it's actually a really amazing document and publication initiative. And the business of the reinsurance industry, of course, is then to model risk, model the not only the stochastic likelihood of calamity, and to develop descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive models for that calamity, but to do so in a way in which that risk model, which is one is distributed throughout, in essence, all of the stakeholders, is one that works at the level of the pricing signal itself. That is, the service that they provide to an insurance company has a price. And the insurance company who wants to insure, let's say, someone to start a new mine, or to build a bridge, or to drill in the Arctic, any of these initiatives can only happen to the extent that they are insured. And they can only be insured to the extent that the enterprise reinsurance industry decides to insure the insurance company that is in fact insuring them. And so the price of any of these initiatives is, by sort of indirectly determined by these risk models, and the initiative itself has a price that is correlated to this. And one of the interesting things about this particular price that's different than other pricing signals that we deal with every day is that it doesn't have any real externalities built into it, or excluded from it, or it has far fewer externalities excluded from it. And just to remind everybody, in classical economics, an externality is any cost that is not reflected in the price signal itself. And so, if in the price itself, so if I sell you a gallon of gasoline for $5, all of the costs of its ultimate impact on our environment are not reflected in that price itself. Those costs are external to the price. They are, in essence, sent downstream. They become somebody else's problem. And this is what we could call the capitalist pricing problem. The old socialist pricing problem was that Hayek wrote about was that planned economies can't possibly figure out what something should cost if they don't have the information processing mechanism of a market, Cadillac-y he called it, in order to figure out what that cost should be. Markets are in this way, a sense, an information processing machine. And what they produce is the price. And because planned economies can't figure that out by themselves, those prices are distorted. That's the socialist pricing problem. Again, the capitalist pricing problem is the fact that the actual prices aren't reflecting the true costs of what any of these, an individual transaction or a large initiative like a drilling enterprise, for example, actually costs. Though to a certain extent, as I say, that the level of the enterprise reinsurance, the ultimate risks are in a way more inclusive within that price than they should be otherwise. And I think there's something to this that should be explored. There's been a lot of very interesting work in the last few years on the redesign, re-engineering of money through Bitcoin, blockchains, massively distributed consensus mechanisms like blockchain. And though I'm really suspicious of the zero-sum logic of the Bitcoin currency and its relationship to it's a deflationary mechanism, all these kinds of things. The general initiative to think about a flatter network for the distribution of that calculation, and that is reliant on the infrastructural capacities of planetary computation, I think is definitely something to consider. After currency, what I'm suggesting is that insurance may be something we should look at as part of how algorithms and an algorithmic governance may have a role to play. And some time ago, Tim O'Reilly, the guy who publishes all the software journals, manuals, wrote a piece in which he argued that the real killer app of the Internet of Things is not marketing, it's insurance. And by this he meant more at a smaller scale, the way in which your refrigerator will narc you out if you eat chocolate cake at 3 in the morning, and your health insurance premiums will go up, and so forth and so on. Or that your car, if you're driving at the right speed limit, your car can make sure that you get a better rate, and the rest of this as well. But the basic idea is that with a kind of a mechanism a mechanism by which actions and transactions within the world are able to sense themselves, account for themselves into some kind of larger governing framework, is not just one by which an actor at a level of an individual person, that their actions can be the true social costs of their actions, the pathologies or virtues of their action could be adjudicated or enforced in relationship to some kind of distributed risk model. But the much larger scale actors, such as mining companies, water companies, textile companies, all of the larger scale actors that are contributing to the violent edge of the Anthropocenic precipice. Also, to a certain degree, the real costs of their actions could, in principle, be incorporated into risk models that are flatter, that are more equitably distributed and administered, in such a way that the price distortion that's built in the capitalist pricing signal could, at least to some degree, in principle, be undistorted. That the real cost of those actions could be governed, because it can be known, because it can be calculated, because it can be administered in some kind of way. And so, to me, this is one perhaps a positive spin to take on the notion of algorithmic governance. Now, people like Morozov have written very, I think, a bit pants on fire, freaked out about the whole idea of algorithmic governance. But I think that there's more for some reasons that are quite appropriate, and others that are not. but I think there's this idea of undistorting the capitalist pricing problem, thinking about risk as distributed models of risk through notions of insurance as another project after to consider after money, and the composition of algorithmic models of risk that are both, again, descriptive, predictive, and then prescriptive as a means toward this is an engineering problem, it's an aesthetic problem, it's an artistic problem, it's a political problem that I think is worth, that is definitely worth our serious attention. So that, in a nutshell, is what I wanted to put on the table for us today.
Thank you, Benjamin. Yes.
So that's why you should all
okay.
We should all get into insurance. That's my point. Yeah.
What was that? Sorry, I didn't hear the last sentence from Benjamin.
We should all get insurance.
Okay.
No, get into insurance, not buy insurance.
Into insurance.
Yeah, that's your career path. Insurance. Yeah.
So should we ask him a few questions because he has to leave the room?
You will have to leave soon, Benjamin, right? I mean, you won't be able to stay with us and hang out for the rest of the conference.
Not for the rest of the conference, but I do. But since I went a little bit earlier than planned, I do have a little bit of time if there's some questions or discussion anybody wants to have.
Yes, I'm sure there is a question indeed. So, did you want to ask?
Yeah, I just had a quick question. My question is, isn't finance capital, with the way derivatives work and futures work, itself is also kind of insurance? So already economy through derivatives and the futures market, and that's also a form of insurance, right? So this, and then as we all know, and I don't know if you had a chance to read Sohail Malik's long essay in the latest issue of Collapse, because he has kind of theorized this other form of rationality that is in sort of like a little bit of like contestation with the normative notion of rationality being proposed by Brandon and Resear and Nicolescu, right? And he calls it risk rationality, and that this type of distributed risk that you're speaking about somehow relates to this type of like a kind of collective risk rationality, which is like sort of understanding how risk works and kind of work it into this emancipatory post-capitalist future. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that we have to get into, right?
Yes, no, I don't mean it. It's not necessarily a bad thing at all. Let me just reply. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting some feedback. I think that there's similarities and difference to what we're saying here. The core similarity, of course, is the observation that speculation is and a kind of modeling of the future is not something that happens that is interstitial or supplemental to the functioning of our core infrastructures. It is central to those. It's central to how the logic of financial capitalism works. It's central to the logic by which these infrastructural investments work. That speculation is in fact a central preoccupation of these infrastructures, and in a way, to the extent to which they become realized in the real world, they are realized in essence as a kind of dissimulation of those speculations in a way. The difference between the kind of risk modeling that, say, hedge funds are based upon, or any kind of strategic self-interested investment strategy in this regard, is that they're based on a collective distribution of that risk, of the composition of capital, the force or its ramifications at a systemic level. In principle, something like the kind of insurance models that we're looking at with the enterprise reinsurance, that the self-interest of the self-interested actor of the research agency is in essence to mitigate risk, to dampen it, or to dissolve it and distribute it in such a way that it has less of a disturbance on the development of things, as opposed to something that like a hedge fund, which is angling for a particular cut or edge within this that it can game toward its own advantage. And so I think this difference between a kind of the individual self-interested actor and something that's more distributed is the key point. What I'm suggesting that we look at is something that is thinking about ways in which these models and a distributed sensing and algorithmic governing infrastructure that can enforce those models could in principle scale to a level by which the most significant and perhaps even the most pathological actors within these economies cannot afford to do what they do, because the actual price that they have to pay in order to actually undertake those investments is prohibitively high, and that at the level of an individual price, that the transactions that each one of us undertake over the course of the day, that those that have a prohibitively high long-term social and ecological cost are ones that we don't undertake, because the price signal, the signal that the system is providing to us, which is a price, makes it prohibitive to do so. And that at the level of the price, there is perhaps a way in which we can think about a kind of a distribution of authority into a mechanism that would allow for the real costs of our choices to be brought to bear in such a way that they can no longer be deferred and no longer be externalized into some kind of outside that no longer exists. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you. We were just muting to say thank you. Actually, it makes sense. But if I can add a couple of words, is that in fact these type of speculations begin with the idea that they're trying to prevent those type of larger disruptions, but then somehow they become more important than what they were taken against, and they kind of take over the driver's seat. And then rather than being like an insurance again.
Yeah, please.
I'm sorry, you're cutting out a bit, Mo. I want to make sure I'm getting the nuance of your point.
Well, I was trying to say that like these type of disruptive speculations are rationalized originally on the basis that they help even out those kind of unexpected bigger interruptions, right? They begin with that, but then they later on they take.
Which one are you talking about again? Like enterprise reinsurance, for example?
No, I'm talking about like the futures markets or like the derivatives, right? They're rationalized originally as a way of evening out those type of disruptions, but they kind of take over and they kind of start exploiting what they were supposed to prevent.
Yes, they do, and they also, and part of the reason this happens, again, my point is that the actual costs that those risk models are being structured against are predicated on a distorted fiction, which is represented in the sum of the externalities that are not brought to bear on those models. The models that are able to be produced are ones that are already in advance inaccurate, and they are inaccurate because what they are allowed to measure does not correlate to their actual effects.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. I wanted to check whether Anna is back with us. Yes, she is. Anna, we are here, and you can continue.
Yeah, now I can see you all. This is amazing. Do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, I can hear you and see you. I think this is working now. I mean, I hope this is working now.
Okay, so sorry, I was muted. So you were interrupted in 1951, and steam engine studies.
Okay, I mean, I know this is gonna be falling in and out. So like, let me just like try to sketch a few points and just you know, like, you know, do a little bit of like a bullet point presentation. I don't think that the connection will not hold for long. For me, the question, you know, like if you are thinking about like cybernetics or system theory as like a new or like a new type of epistemological system or a type of epistemological system that could be used as a theoretical model, I think that, my position would be that I would find it problematic because, you know, like cybernetics is from its inception the treatment of action and reaction as an integrated equation. So that's basically what it is. You know, like it's something that is stems from an engineering problem and that then gets extrapolated into like a metaphysical or like, let's say, an all-encompassing theory. But, you know, in a way, it could also be seen, or it could also be narrated as a system that pretty much models materialist dialectics, but then replaces what Marx sees as like a fundamental antagonism as a form of like integrating social action and reaction into this model of like the system and, you know, like and how the system operates within its environment. And the way it's narrated within social theory, system theory, is that, you know, like of course, like a system is operationally closed, so a system only has its operation at its only can function through its operations, or only has its operations at its disposal in order to form its structures. And then in the end, somehow what you get or what you end up with is this model of like a neoliberal economy or a neoliberal democracy, which runs on a loop iteratively, which is pretty much what Fukuyama had in mind when he spoke about the end of history. So basically, the end of history is the emergence of like a neoliberal iterative democracy that just perpetuates itself in power because it completely like let's say overwrites any kind of like political tension or any kind of possibility for like a political conflict. I don't know. Please tell me if you're still on, because you know, like I see that my signal keeps flickering, so I'm a bit unsure. And and I also cannot see myself, so this is like you know, like it's a very strange.
Don't say it's alienating. I'm kidding. Yeah, so we're here with you, and we can continue with you for another 5 minutes. Yeah, up to 5. That was the verdict. So go ahead, Anna. Just continue your thought.
Well, I mean, basically, I would say that you know, like the biggest problem at the moment is not you know, like there's a big resurgence on this like techno utopian ideal, you know, like this idea that somehow technology can provide a way out, or that technology can provide us with a solution. But clearly the problem is not technology. I believe that it was Mosalemi who said that technology, and he was meaning cybernetics, is non-aligned politically, but the issue is not whether technologies are aligned or non-aligned politically. The issue is, well, you know, like what you do with this technology, and clearly technology in and of itself will never provide for a solution. You know, like you can never solve social problems through technological means unless you politicize technology, unless you politicize the usage of technology, and also like in terms of like the issue of labor. You know, like technology never really solved the issue of exploitation through labor. In most cases, it renders workers more pliable and more prone to exploitation. And interestingly enough, you know, like in the digital economy, most companies, or a lot of the successful companies, are, for instance, like companies that provide cleaning services or nail bars, or basically companies that exploit cheap labor and how to say, like long working hours, provided by people that are in precarious situations, like people that don't have like full citizenship rights or something. And am I still with you? I don't know anymore.
Yes,
You are.
yes, you are.
Yeah, basically, I don't really know what to add to this discussion because I don't know what we.
No, it was I think a very clear statement. So we don't.
Oh God, what happened there?
That was just adding a little bit of drama to the sweaty afternoon. Yes. So so I think your intervention or your statement was very clear. I don't think that something stayed in the air, but a lot can be then drawn from it as well. Yes.
Hey Anna, it's Patricia. Hey.
Hi.
Hey, how you doing? I just have a quick question because I totally agree with you, and I think a lot of the stuff that's being qualified as techno-utopianism is like very quick to acknowledge that it's not going to save the day. The question is if there is a potential for the political alignment, because that's what it seems like. I mean, and I agree with you that you can't just kind of just develop this and avoid, and it's going to save humanity. Of course not. It's got to take on a political alignment. And if you're skeptical, absolutely on this point, or if you see any sort of potential for this, because I think that's basically where the argument is going to kind of.
Not at all, but you know, like for me, the problem is like how this narrative seems to be, because for instance, like with system theory, you always deny that there's an agency at the individual level. So basically, agency or volition is something that only emerges out of the combined actions of all the actors or agents or elements in the system. So basically, you would say that social systems have an agency or have a volition, but individual human persons do not have an agency or a volition. And for instance, like I find this type of narratives like really problematic because, of course, like what they create is the sense of alienation from political, or basically they create a sense of like political disenfranchisement. I mean, I would say at an epistemological level or at the metaphysical level, or however you choose to put it. Like in that sense, I would. I mean, I would much more be interested in the way, for instance, Maturana and Varela formulate the issue of agency. Basically, they say that life is intention. You know, like something is alive when it has the intention of staying alive. So that's what life is. It's volition. And this could also be extrapolated into like a metaphysical or epistemological level. But of course, like I mean, yeah. I would say that it's not that I'm overall skeptical. It's also not that I'm overall skeptical about the contribution of cybernetics and system theory. But I think that all these contributions need to be scrutinized, and you know, like they cannot just be accepted bulk. And there's a lot of like how can you say, like you know, like there's a lot of traps within this narrative. Also, like I started talking about energy and entropy. I mean, of course, like I realized that with this kind of connection and with this kind of reception, and also like the fact that I don't see myself talking, I feel really strange. So I don't think that this is the proper setting to try to go really into depth about that. But I think that this. Even at this level of like how scientific concepts emerge, and how they are used and how they are narrated and how they are accepted as objective, one needs to always remain vigilant, because it's like, for instance, the concept of entropy is an extremely problematic concept. Entropy is not a physical law; it's just an empirical description, and that entropy became such a fundamental concept, for instance, for cybernetics at large. It's something that, like, I would definitely not accept without discussion. I don't know if I answered what you were saying.
Well, I think that the one very important, and I think in the framework of this discussion, novel observation that you made is actually the conflation and bringing into the connection the system theory and Fukuyama and the end of history, which I think is quite a quite a provocative thought in itself, and the kind of the absorption of action and reaction within that kind of undifferentiated ocean of system relations is, I think, an interesting perspective on.
But Antonio, can I just interject? It's not provocative. Fukuyama is, also Hayek. Hayek refers at length to cybernetics and system theory, because he also says that order in a market system is an emergent property. This is a concept that somehow dovetails very nicely, with all of his ideas of how to manage the market economy. But also, one needs to take into account that all the rhetorics that cybernetics is based on is already present in Adam Smith and the law, the idea of the natural price, and basically these twin principles, that also surface in Malthus as reproduction and starvation. They are also present in Darwin as fecundity and competition or survival. So basically, the rate of fecundity is the rate at which a species propagates itself, and then there's this, and then there's this other blade that somehow keeps the species in check by a high rate of mortality. And this also surfaces in information theory as signal and noise, again, these twin principles. And they are also present in Adam Smith as supply and demand. And so basically, this type of social narrative, or this type of integrated explanation of how a social model functions, is something that exists since the dawn of British liberalism. And I think I mentioned it elsewhere. There's this book by Otto Meyer that's precisely about how since the moment when James Watt, when the governor is integrated into the steam engine, immediately this gives rise to a whole plethora of political metaphors that always talk about checks and balances and how to say what's the English word for that, dynamic equilibrium, and so basically, the same metaphors that are still with us at the present time. So I just wanted to say that it's not provocative to link system theories with Fukuyama. Fukuyama was very aware of the rhetoric that he was building on. You're there?
Yes. I was somehow invoked in the beginning of your presentation, and I totally understand what you were referring to. It was about the response I wrote.
Mohammed, hi.
Hello, how you doing? First time face to face. But
yeah,
and because we don't have time,
but at least image to image.
But I'm glad that we met in this type of interface, because there's something symbolic about it. But I just wanted to say that what we have to keep in mind, though, is that two things I'm going to say, because we can just basically you and me have this conversation for the next hour, but I don't think we have time. But the fact that Marxist dialectics itself, if synthesis in Marxist dialectics itself is a form of resolving the contradiction, not constantly, like this negation is not always forever, right? And that synthesis itself can be measured or can be thought of. And the second point is that when we talk about cybernetics, there's this history of cybernetics that we know when does it begin, which we know what it is, and I'm sure you're very well aware of it because all your references were absolutely correct. And then there's this, what I call like prehistory of cybernetics that actually goes back to Thomas Hobbes and Hume, and again, your references there, linking it to Adam Smith, linking it to political economy, are correct, and which I consider all that prehistory of cybernetics. But also, but just like any other area of knowledge, cybernetic cannot be reduced to this history. And even like people like Norbert Wiener were wrong to have certain assumptions about what this all means. And a lot of us think that cybernetic is much larger than what we historically have done or have known about it. And keeping this idea open and not stigmatizing it, I think, is what we are trying to do, and trying to sort of like steer it towards more emancipatory politics is what the project of someone like me is, not to somehow rationalize a set of like legacy cybernetic technologies from the past and try to insist on their validity today. So there is a way to work this, but I guess we don't have time here to kind of like hash out some of it. So yeah, that's all I had to say.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, as I said, you know, like I was extremely interested in Maturana and Varela and the concept of autopoiesis, but then, of course, that itself calls into question a lot of the basic tenets of system theory, namely, like this idea that systems are operationally closed. And I mean, okay, like I know that, also, like maybe we can email over that some other time, because of course, like we will bore everyone to death here if we start to go on that track. But yeah, like as I told Patricia, it's not that I wouldn't also like want to appear as a Luddite or like want to say that I'm completely skeptical or that I have an anti-technological position. This is not at all the case. Hello? We're here. We're with you. Thank you, Anna. I think we have to move on. Thank you so much. So, can someone take over because my
Adam's ready.
please take over.
He's my guy.
Maybe talk to Adam and tell him about
Hey, Adam.
Oh,
How are we? Yeah, so we're just running a little bit behind. So Bassam, are you good to go? And Adam, is that cool for you?
yeah, cool. Just what, 5 minutes or something?
All right. And Bassam, can I get a? Oh la la, that was a diss.
Everybody here okay?
But I know Bassam's on a schedule tight one as well, so I just want to see how that's going. Okay, he's back. Hey, Bassam. Are you good to go? Because I'm going to introduce you, and we're going to keep this like...
I mean, if Adam wants to go first, it's okay with me. It's completely okay.
Am I on?
Let's stick with the schedule-ish, sort of. So, okay. So I'm going to introduce you.
There might be some background noise in a few minutes with the call to prayer here. So I'm not sure if it's going to be absolutely noisy and disruptive for my presentation, or so. I mean, yeah.
Okay, I will just quickly introduce you so that we give you a bit of the context. So, welcome, Bassam. So this is Bassam El Baroni. He's an independent curator and theory teacher at the Dutch Art Institute in Arnhem. He's curated and co-curated projects and exhibitions in Resear, Madrid, Oslo, Bergen, Lofoten, Limerick, Paris, and Alexandria. He is currently curating a project for the Home Works 7 Forum in Beirut, opening in November 2015, and he's joining us where he lives from Alexandria in Egypt. So, it's all yours, Bassam. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Thank you, Mo. Thank you, everybody, for this invitation. Am I quite clear, or is there any problem with the sound?
I think it's good.
Okay. Basically, my response comes in the form of a set of very rough notes that takes the last of the 5 questions as a starting point. The question about technological algorithms. These brief, roughly sketched out points intersect the following areas: generative models, composition and its centrality in art, analogy as a primary scaffolding for cognitive systems, the structure of reality in relation to the adequacy of art to it, and finally alienation as a concept. And I'm just going to try and go through everything rather quickly, you know, they're just like sketches of ideas, basically, trying to respond to the thematic. So in her book, An Introduction to Genetic Algorithms in 1999, and a series of papers published in the very early 2000s, Melanie Mitchell talks about the centrality of analogy making to every aspect of cognition. She defines analogy making as, quote, the perception of 2 or more non-identical objects or situations as being the same at some abstract level, unquote. On a very basic level, for example, children recognize the sameness of dogs, although there is a huge difference between a Chihuahua and a Saint Bernard, and the difference between images of them and the dogs in the flesh. More abstractly, for example, we recognize the sameness of the essential sameness of an original Beatles song and the Muzak version of it playing in the background in a supermarket. Thus, she identifies analogy making as a process that can be characterized very broadly as, quote, distilling the essence of one situation and adapting it via conceptual slippage to fit another situation, unquote. So here, basically, she says that the ability for concepts to slip from situation to situation in this fluid way is a hallmark of human thought, and is one of the salient differences between what was back then, and remember this is the late 90s when she was writing this, is the hallmark, this fluidity through conceptual slippage is the hallmark of human thought, and is one of the salient differences between human intelligence and the rigid literality of computers. Now, what computational science is now able to gradually abolish is this rigid literality. This is achieved more and more by more and more integration of the characteristics of human conceptual slippage, which allow complex analogy making into its algorithms. So via this notion of conceptual slippage, and it's important, one could say the more the normative cognitive constraints associated with the human are configured into algorithmic formula, the more efficient and precise they become. That is to say that algorithms are essentially striving and heading towards the negative. They adapt to the human through the negative as hinged on analogy making as a primal structure of cognition. One of those less fluid, more rigidly literal computerized automatons recently killed a worker at a German Volkswagen plant. Had it been programmed more negatively, i.e. to make analogies via conceptual slippage, the worker might have not met his fate. But why is But why is this process of analogy making important in the first place? Because the faculty to make analogies is the faculty by which one can eliminate possibilities through the identification of sameness. Because in any circumstance or context, all possibilities have to be potentially available, but they can't all be equally available. Mitchell gives the example of ants foraging for food to illustrate this idea. Quote, many ants wander in random directions from the nest. When one locates a food source by sight or smell, it picks up some of the food and returns to the nest, leaving a pheromone trail. Other ants follow such trails when they encounter them, following the trails to the food sources and reinforcing the trails with more pheromone. In this way, the shortest trails leading to the best food sources attain the strongest scent. And increasing numbers of ants follow these trails, but at any given time, some ants are still following weaker, less plausible trails, and some ants are still foraging randomly, allowing for the possibility of new food sources to be found, unquote. Now, if we take Robert Brandam's idea that the core of alienation is basically, quote, the opposition and competition between normative attitudes and normative statuses, unquote, now let us transpose this to the behavior of the foraging ants. The randomly foraging ants cannot be mistaken and reintroduced as individualistic entities, thus cutting them off from collective possibility and cultivating their individualism as a goal in itself, making that goal the end of the activity of foraging. Their independent, that is to say, normative attitudes are part and parcel of the universal ant foraging strategy. That is to say, the normative status of ant foraging activity. Thus, to sync the individual's subjective attitude to the group normative status and vice versa, making most of the possibilities is to reinvent alienation as constructive alienation. What has happened in a field such as art is that the generic has been misunderstood as the generic individualistic tendency. For example, when attitudes become form. This is a clear kind of idea of what I mean by this, and not the collective structure that generates possibilities. That is to say, it has been understood as composition, not model. And this struggle between the idea of composition and its opposite, the idea of the generative model, has formed an emergent, under-recognized territory within contemporary practice in recent years. So what do I mean by this? And I'll talk a little bit later about the threat of the generative model, or the threat of the abolition of composition. And I think it kind of resonates with a lot of the, let's say, the kind of things that people like Anselm were talking about when he was talking about the new positive kind of positivism. It actually comes, I mean, like this, such fears of such positivism come from the threat, in my opinion, come from the threat of the abolition of composition. Now, what do I mean by this? Like here, we go back to a quote from Deleuze and Guattari, and in their 1991 book, What is Philosophy? Where they say composition is the sole definition of art. Composition is aesthetic, and what is not composed is not a work of art. So for Deleuze and Guattari, the composition is the primal characteristic of all art, whether visual, oral, written, or a fusion of these. The composition's main function is to synthesize a compound of sensations. These compounds can be conceptual or formal and come in varieties or monumental types that we can classify. This is basically why we can recognize that art is art while maintaining the idea that anything can be art. Even silence, blankness, and stillness, indicators sometimes used in art, are composed or are part of a composition. This simple fact complicates and places extra demands on recent calls for exiting contemporary art and making art more adequate for the computational present and future. Art's historic and normative association with composition is rooted in the process through which it readapted its labor from the labor of making things to serve traditional, artisanal, religious, and functional purposes to the labor that emphasizes the extraction of the percept, i.e., the mental concept that is established as a consequence of the process of perception. From these perceptions come from external cognizable objects. The labor associated with art became a labor of perceptual extraction and thus became firmly dependent on individuality, subjective narratives, and overemphasis on differences as sources for variation in percept extraction. So the claim is that unless we take research and its presentation in events to simply be art without question, composition remains the general and essential characteristic of what art is until today. But while this may be the case, these compositions, they exist, or they're assumed to exist, within what can be called the culture of the generative. What is this? What is this culture of the generative? What is the difference between the generative model or the generative computational model and between composition? The model is all that the composition is not. Its power lies in setting up a dynamic infrastructure that is not dependent on the extraction of percepts from external objects, but the equalization and processing of everything inside a model for which everything is indiscriminately input and output data. The question emerges then, does not advocacy to generative culture entail the questioning and rethinking of composition as that which is art's principle? And can there be any exit from contemporary art without exiting composition itself? Now, if we go back to this fear of the abolition of composition, we find that even in the idea of the generative or the idea of the generic, that is posed by artists such as Marcel Duchamp, and then the whole of contemporary art is formulated on basically the idea of the generic that begins with the Duchampian. Here we can say that it was never allowed to become or shift into the idea of a model, because what happens is that the Duchampian, for example, Pessoa, is reintegrated as an individualistic gesture, or as a composition through the act of signage, right? So the act of signage guarantees it remains a composition and brings it back to individuality. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that an art that tries to understand the structure of reality is an art that understands that in the first instance, the algorithm is a human algorithm that is based on kind of negativity that is inbuilt in the human, like I gave through this example of the striving towards negativity earlier on in the presentation. So that's what I had to say today.
Okay.
Thank you, Bassam. Well, we're very short on time, and we have almost like guests lined up. I think the best is to go to Julieta, and then after Julieta, I think maybe if Adam comes back, we can try Adam. But Adam's in a class and has to go back to his students, and he's trying to see if the students want to watch this so they can connect it and they watch it together. But anyway, hello Julieta, can you hear me? You want to like unmute yourself, please?
Hey there.
Hello. So we can hear you.
Hello, hello.
It's going to be very painterly. So let's just go with this like digital painterly. So yeah, so for your segment, as we discussed earlier, I was going to like do it more in the format of a question and answer. And before I even start, I would like to introduce you based on your bio, which is very short. And it says, Julieta Aranda, Mexico City, is an artist and editor of eFlux Journal. So you're fine only with this?
I am
if you are
fine.
Okay, so yeah, so Julieta, you received those questions, right? And you sort of have an idea about what the premise of the conference is. My first question from you will be to how do you, and you know what I mean, like I can actually talk about your piece at the Guggenheim Museum right now, which is like one of my favorite art pieces, especially one of the, because I hadn't seen it and we saw it together, and I've been thinking and reflecting on it, and I brought it up yesterday in the workshop that we had and talked about it a little bit with people who came to the workshop. So if you can keep that piece in mind or not, and talk about how do you conceptualize what is artistic research for you as an artist, and how do you go about actually doing it, and what do you consider sort of like the more productive and successful sides of it, and maybe later we can reflect on its limitations.
I'm sorry. Can you can you rephrase that, because I couldn't and slowly because my that I have to explain in a natural center in Mexico, so my internet is really lousy at the moment.
How do you conceptualize the possibilities of artistic research, and how do you see its limitations?
Okay, that's I mean, okay, just 1 second, let me put on, I think, to solve my problems. Let's see, is this going to help? One quick second more, I'm sorry. Okay, can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. I try to, I mean, like, I'll say a couple of things, right? I try to not think a lot in terms of art as research. A little, no, that doesn't work. I'm a little bit suspect of, it's a little bit of thinking of art as archiving, yeah, or of art as language. I think that those are not synonyms. I think so. And maybe that's why I'm trying to ask you to rephrase the question, because there is something there that doesn't quite work for me. I'm not a researcher. I'm an artist. So to think of what I do in terms of research already is it's already giving me a little bit of a contradiction. And I'm sorry that I start like that, but it's something to do with defining the terms. I think that if we try to think of artists as researchers, we would be very poor researchers, right? Yeah. We don't have a methodology, and why should we? In the same way in which I do not want to see a philosophy professor make artwork because it would be pretty lousy. I would not want to be an artist as a researcher, I think, or as an artist. I mean, like all those kinds of methodologies of the social sciences. I mean, like, speak to me of a lack of something a kind of a lack of a proper contemporary language within my field that tends to try to make up for that lack by borrowing terminology from other fields, yeah? And then that can, so I do not, which is a way to say I do not conceive of what I do as research.
Let's put it that way then. What do you, like, because obviously you don't identify as artists as research, and that's not how you conduct your work. So, but because we're still talking about artistic research, and as the editor of eFlux, you completely understand the rise of this paradigm of art production and art practice as research-based. What do you see as the limitations of it being something that's actually practiced, but also it being a category of language that's applied to art? So what do you see as these two limitations?
I mean, okay, if I speak specifically about my practice, because of what I do, of living as an artist and also being the editor of a journal, I have a very particular position, which is not passive. Yeah, I do not. This means that I do not take text that comes to me and and see sort of what is trending. I apply it towards my work, but I am in a position where I can actually commission text and commission discourse that has to do with topics that I'm interested in. So that kind of changes where I place myself in terms of, like, something I'm interested in right now is, and this has to do both with my own practice and with what we are doing with the journal, is to break away a little bit from academic models. Which is something that we are doing right now with Super Community. I don't know if you have noticed that.
Oh, Tori, I notice it every day of the week. but so in a way, you also have this other understanding of writing, which is somewhere even between art and the research, which is usually what writers do, right? So even like for you even like to see another type of writing, which is not strictly research-based writing, which is this other form of writing, which actually your seminar with the News Center hopefully will get deeper into it, right? Which is sort of like artist writing, or a type of writing that is not necessarily itself research-based. And you're interested in that, and you support that through the journal, and Super Community is a good example of it.
Yes, absolutely.
Sorry, not unmuted.
But no, yes, that's. I mean, there is something about the kind of urgency that I like to think can exist in art. That I also like to see present in writing. That maybe sometimes I do not find in. I mean, there is a kind of like trade-off between urgency and methodology, right? And I think, if like at this moment, this has not been true all the time, but I think I allow myself to change my mind fairly often. At this moment, I favor urgency over methodology, so I do not much care in terms of my practice, again, and what the journal is doing for academic precision and a kind of like a methodological formalities, let's say, and rather try to look at both within my subject matter and within the mode of publishing. And I mean, I don't make a big difference between what I'm doing with the journal and what I do as an artist, so most of my statements are applying to both things. But also trying to look at the format of publishing that we use, right? Then it's important to see how it can better be used to deliver this sense of, yeah, I guess urgency would be the best word, even though it's not fantastically accurate at the moment.
Do you think this then, as a sort of a category applied to art, is something that will come and go, like a lot of other semantics sort of like paradigms that came to dominate how we see art, and then we gave up on it, or
which one? I'm sorry, say again.
The quote unquote art-based research or research-based art, or or it's possible that because of the sort of like the way all of culture and all of our human activities are somehow being systematized through the cybernetic revolution, we might be stuck with this, and artists more and more will be seen as another form of researchers.
No, I doubt. I highly doubt that. I think that's, I would say more, I mean, like, just like seeing it, like what I have gotten to see in my lifetime of, I mean, like these like modes of seeing art and modes of functioning within an artistic practice. I think that the artist as researcher is something that, and again, you know, like to me, this speaks of a lack of a language that I would want to come from the field itself and not from a borrowing of other disciplines. Yes, and I mean, and I see glimpses of things that happen sometimes that become interested. I mean, like what I find problematic on the artist as researcher, or the artist as archivist, or the artist as activist, or the artist as theologian, or whatever you want them, you know, the artist as ... is that that is a kind of I mean, like I'm sorry, I'm missing the word. But it's sort of like a predatory approach that just like preys on other disciplines and brings very little to the field. Yeah. So, like the artist as anthropologist brings very little to anthropology, but borrows something to make the work appear topical or interesting. Yes. So I mean, like I think at this moment, what I want to see, and I see it not in movements, but maybe in isolated works. Yeah. Moments when there is a language that is being developed, when there is something that is not taking the envelope, not taking not relying on references, not relying on somebody else's language, but actually using the tools of art in the kind of like beautifully omnivorous way in which they can be used, be it clay and stone or algorithms and screens, to develop images and a kind of semantics that cannot be expressed by any other means. And I find that quite different from research, hopefully.
You know, this is a very interesting conversation because you're the contrarian for almost like the so far people have spoken. I mean, no one really has come out and defended like this thing called artistic research wholeheartedly. And the title of the conference somehow includes both limits and horizons of.
But can I ask you something? How many artists have you had talking?
How many artists have we had so far? If I count as an artist, yeah, a few.
1/3.
6 people, right?
6.
But,
6 out of 11.
But what I was, you know, to make.
We're talking about authorship, and I think it's very interesting what Mera is bringing into the picture.
Absolutely.
In terms of, you know, like first of all, in terms of, you know, art's continuous, kind of urge to legitimize itself, to, I think, isn't it loud enough? To just kind of legitimize itself through this, you know, different fields, through claiming, you know, some kind of a special kind of entry to these different fields, right?
It's not claiming, it's challenging.
So I think it's very interesting, and this is the question that we had over the last semester, that obviously also stems from, you know, the kind of the impetus and the kind of imperative of artistic research also very much stems from the reconfiguration of the academic field, right, and the creation of the artistic PhD programs and so on. So this kind of prolongation of the kind of the precarious student, but it's still less precarious than actually, you know, trying to activate your role in some kind of real economy. That doesn't work, right? So it's kind of an imperative. Artistic research is in itself a symptom of a larger set of factors that are, you know, kind of influencing the overall art field. I think, yeah, did you want to say something? And then like really, it's like, it's past 9, guys. So we have.
Hi, Julia.
And we still have quite a few people to go.
So just to say, I really support your idea to reject research, but actually what I'm for, it's investigation.
Yeah, that's entirely different. Investigation is something that is more disorganized and that it does not need them. Absolutely.
Because it's a kind, I see this also as a kind, so I'm looking at you, it's really stupid, I have to look at the audience. But because we are really here between the virtual and the real, where the virtual becomes more real than the virtual, than the real. Yeah, so just say like this. If we are actually witnessing a total academization of art through bringing research as a let's say additional or a reform that has to be on its own, because what I'm witnessing for years, working also with students, is that they are really suffering under this. That they have actually to produce to do a research, and then out of a research to produce an artwork, which is then a total violence over the let's say a production of something that is called art. So this is also then a big question, because I disagree also with some part of that what you thought. But just let me finish that. It's really hot here, so I'm trying also to concentrate. So, so what's happening actually with the same was actually when in the traditional academies where you had painters, you know, especially in the 80s after the whole, let's say, conceptualism that was actually as a background of the new painting. You had at the same time this request in these traditional academies to produce a drawing, a sketch that is actually has to lead to the painting. But it was totally absurd to have this again with the new image and with the new, let's say, painting, which was totally absurd. But it still was let's say, a big notion at the academies, at the schools. So for me, it is a kind of a continuation of the terror of this, let's say. So, but what I really disagree is that I think the only way that art breaks its own frame and its own constraints is to go out of its so-called field. Because what is the field of art? You know, this is now a question. And by, you know, so for in this sense, I would disagree. So I'm going to stop now because I think we're also quite tight with the time. And yeah, my name is Milica Tomic.
Okay.
So in regards to.
I'll just answer to you for a second. I mean, like, I agree with the differentiation. I think it's very good to define the terms between research and investigation. Yeah, like those are two quite different things. And now like what I disagree is I not exactly disagree, but I think it's also something about defining terms. It's not about the academization of art, but it's rather a professionalization of all the humanities. Yeah. So there is like a set of requisites that come now that have to do much more with this like really specific set of professional requisites, like the professional artist, let's say, which is different from academization, because to reject academization would be almost to say that I reject an intellectual approach to art, which is very, very far from the truth, that I am very much advocating for, but just not in a professional manner. Yeah, I think that that's like one of the very few luxuries of art, is to be able to approach a subject and not have to touch it in this prescribed way, not by ways of a prescribed language. And when I talk about the art field, it's something, and it's something that has to do with a certain, like precisely with this freedom. I mean, like, and it's maybe field is the wrong word because I'm trying to get out of professional discourse, and here I am using precisely those professional words. Yeah, but there is a production of meaning within that kind of freedom that is not based on methodologies of research or on scavenging other disciplines, which always ends up resulting with somewhat weak, trending artworks. Or like there's some kind of like weakening that happens for me there. So I guess, I mean, like that kind of space where a kind of like meaning can be produced by way of curiosity and investigation without following into this professional approach, and where tools can be mixed and matched and really sort of like metabolized. Yeah, I mean, it's like I would say that there is something metabolic that happens there. If that makes any sense. I'm sorry that.
Would it be good to end it here, because we got like a little bit behind. I mean, more than a little bit. So okay. So should we give it for Julieta? Yeah, especially since you kind of like brought like the kind of necessary like negativity into the whole like conference. So you can stick around and watch, but I think since Adam's in the classroom and I don't see him kind of like activating his mic and his camera, we can go for Jason Adams. And Jason, are you ready? Do you want to go next?
Okay, guys, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Lovely to have you.
He's ready. I'm ready right now. 1 second.
Okay, Jason, you're on if you turn your camera on.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, but we don't see you. But maybe other people are seeing you, so I'm not sure.
First, no camera. The camera is not working. I'm not sure why. Okay, there it is.
Oh, there it is. Okay, go ahead. Let me introduce you, Jason, because some people here might not know who you are and what you do. Jason is my colleague at the New Center, by the way, but I actually would like to read a little bio of Jason for you. There we go. Jason Adams is a member of the organizing committee at the New Center for Research and Practice and a professor at Kendall College of Art and Design in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Adams has published in numerous international journals such as Critical Inquiry, Radical Philosophy, and Boundary 2. From 2004 to 2010, he was the managing editor of the Johns Hopkins University Press journal called Theory and Event, before co-editing the volume Deleuze and Race and writing his first book, Occupy Time, Technoculture, Immediacy, and Resistance After Occupy Wall Street. We have here my colleague, Jason Adams. Go ahead, Jason.
Thank you, Mohammed. Could somebody turn off the, I'm just getting like an echo in the room.
Already did it.
Okay, cool. Okay, so so my talk today is called "The Public Has No Interest in Opinions," and I'm responding today to the first question, which was when many of the principles behind contemporary art celebrate the discipline as a territory for subjective interpretability, how can this knowledge transcend the limits of the personal to articulate crucial distinctions between opinion and knowing? So today I'm going to do so by discussing the difference between collective judgment and public emotion, which is what people usually mean by public opinion, although it's used differently in this, as you'll see. Then I'm going to move to a consideration of public emotion's role in the EU-Germany-Greece debacle, and then that will proceed into a discussion of Virilio's Museum of the Accident and the relevance of this for understanding how art might address what I'm calling the accident of citizenship that's recently been on display for us, and then concluding with a call for stereo rationality, which is an expansion upon the concept of stereo reality, which is from Virilio, but I've heard other people use it besides Virilio as well. So just to begin, the first thought that arises for me here on this particular question is the question of affect, and the so-called affective turn, which has been the assertion that that affect can serve either to break or form habits of perception, at least when it's how it's understood in the chain of which comes from Bergson of perception, affection, action. And this is or was a especially compelling assertion if you accept the assumption or the presupposition that affect retains the potential to undermine false universals with true universals. For example, the notion that the only true universal is the singularity rather than particularity centered one of the coming community in Agamben, or the community of those who have nothing in common in Lingus. Jean-Luc Nancy and others have very similar concepts, Blanchot, the unavowable community, and that sort of thing. Or in the cinematic reversal of phenomenology that we find in Cinema 2, which proceeds, quote, not from the acentered state of things back to the centered embodied self, but which goes back up from the centered embodied self to the acentered state of things in order to get close to it. Broadly speaking, reversing what phenomenology put forth. So in other words, if it is true that, as Ravesson asserted in the 19th century work of Habit, that the self, i.e. the citizen subject, the gendered subject, any other kind of subject or self, is essentially nothing but a habit, a kind of repetition compulsion. And if it is the case that the subjective consciousness thereby produced operates as a filter to selectively perceive only that which fits its personal schemata, then affect, according to its defenders, can be used as a mechanism for bringing us closer to knowledge and judgment, since we're thereby freed from the kind of subjectivism and relativism of personal schemata. Affect in this way has been conceived as a kind of trans-individual, kind of Simondonian type of thing. So I'm going to kind of question that a little bit. And my question is basically, while affect can deliver us from this realm into that of knowledge and judgment, one question that remains is whether we can really still affirm affect in this way today specifically, or whether affect is increasingly just another example in which subjective interpretability or individual opinion continues to reign over and above knowledge and judgment. Perhaps affect has itself become primarily personalistic today, not because, conceptually speaking, it was articulated in that manner that would ensure that, but rather because our political, economic, and technocultural enframing, meaning, for example, the propaganda effect of cable television news, the panoptic effect of social media conformity, the disciplinary effect of mass revelations about national in the U.S. through the NSA electronic surveillance, and also transnational, as many other countries learned to their dismay, is such that our emotive or affective plasticity is now more than ever molded to precisely the preferred schemata that affect itself was supposed to break. So here I'd like to bring in the thoughts of the French urbanist and cultural theorist Paul Virilio, who I wrote my MA thesis on and I later studied directly with during my PhD. In this latter period of my involvement with Virilio and his work, I contributed a commentary chapter to his book, Gray Ecology, and then in 2010 I published an interview with him in the journal Boundary 2, which was entitled The Speeds of Ambiguity. And in this interview I asked Virilio whether what he began to describe in the post-9/11 period as the synchronization of emotion had made affect somewhat ineffective as for the supposedly critical role that had been ascribed to it by the advocates of the affective turn, given that mass media and today's social media and just the simple knowledge of mass surveillance both produce and synchronize affect. And Virilio's response to this question was as follows. Quote, one mustn't confuse the status of public opinion with public emotion, because opinion is in general reasonable. It is what the public has in common in general, whereas emotion is individual. So we go from the collectivization of opinion to an emotional community, which is obviously individualist. The definition of emotions is that they are felt individually, even if the whole world feels it at the same time. And here I think if we're seeking a knowledge that transcends the limits of the personal to articulate distinctions between opinion and knowing, we'd have to parse out the distinction of public opinion versus public emotion as he divides the two. Virilio identifies public opinion specifically with reason, and so when he's saying public opinion, you could say the same thing by saying collective judgment. I think it's just the way he phrased it. And most importantly, with the physico-mental process of collective reasoning. While public emotion is described as that which is, quote, felt individually even if the whole world feels it at the same time, unquote. Public emotion, therefore, is the emotion of those who remain individualized and totalized by way of structural schemata. To be sure, each person experiences individualized and totalized emotion, as though it were expressive of a process proceeding from individual opinion to collective judgment. But in fact, what happens is a much more passively received synchronization of individual emotions, or what we might call reason without reasoning. So as an example, you can take the recent EU-Germany Greece debacle. You can easily see here that this synchronization of emotions, this reason without reasoning, occurs not only in mass media but also in social media. If one who is on the left, for example, affirms the transnational over the national on the register of political ontology, one is immediately scripted as cryptically affirming the German hegemonized EU as it exists in its present form, and thus as being secretly pro-austerity. While if one who is on the left wants to express solidarity with Greece, the sole option seems to be affirming only exit or autarky, even though we know that an actual exit from the imperatives of capital is as impossible today in the context of a globalized neoliberal economy as is the implicit alternative of autarky, and of course for the same reason. While physico-mental processes of collective reasoning might help us understand that what most thoroughly distinguishes the present form of the EU from its immediate past or possible future is not the rise of post-nationalism, but much to the contrary, the resurgence of nationalism, especially within its most hegemonic member state, that being Germany, which is what more than anything really enabled, according to some, if you've seen Habermas's recent statement, this is the argument that he makes, enabled the current bid for German hegemony over the Eurozone as a whole. And so the critique of nationalism and its role in the Greek capitulation is kind of nowhere to be found, really, except when it can be used to denounce transnationalism as nothing more than a cover for German nationalism, and as harboring no other potential whatsoever. And those types of potentials might include, for example, the dissolution of individual European states, the introduction of a democratic socialist EU state, which could legislate EU-wide policy via some kind of radicalized democracy, or any other number of alternative potentialities that would remain, that do remain for the most part off the radar entirely, because we're just simply thinking either it's the EU kind of run by Germany or it's Greek autarky. Virilio is most well known in the art world. I guess there's a few different areas. He's written about, he has a book called The Accident of Art, and a number of other Art and Fear, and a number of other books that are also important. But probably his most important concept, or most widely understood concept, is his idea of a museum of accidents. And in this museum of accidents, he says, we would be able to see that, for example, the invention of the train is also always at the same time the invention of the train wreck. And amongst other places, this was temporarily realized at the Fondation Cartier pour l'Art in Paris in 2002. There was an exhibition, but it's really just a temporary thing. And so here I think we can see an art of knowledge that, as our first question for today calls for, would transcend the limits of the personal to articulate crucial distinctions between opinion and knowing. Opinion here would be that which posits only the train and not the train wreck, while knowledge, of course, at least as I'm framing it, would consist of a much broader scope that would include the kind of full temporality and duration of this technological object. Now, in the same interview from Boundary 2, I asked Virilio whether the invention of the national citizen subject after the French and American Revolutions, the Treaty of Westphalia, and that sort of thing, whether this invention that is today at issue in the EU, Germany, and Greece debacle is not also the invention of its own dissolution, of its own train wreck. And Virilio's response was that today, while the national limit of citizenship is going away, in a certain sense, quote, the borders are nowhere but the walls are everywhere. He then proceeded to provide a genealogy of borders, which begins with the walls around cities, then giving way to borders around nations, and now, quote, the movement of Europe into the European Union, which has, quote, suppressed the reality of borders but recreated the walls. So these new walls are, of course, those distinguishing what is inside versus outside the EU, what is inside versus outside, you know, the gated community, what is inside versus outside the city, you know, versus the suburbs, and that sort of thing. And for Virilio, this changes completely what it means to be a citizen. Because aside from the shifts in how boundaries are constituted, the public immediate character of decision-making today is such that tyranny, insofar as tyranny still exists, it no longer really resides in a specific individual, such as a dictator or a president who's declared a state of emergency or something like that, but rather in the technique itself, in that which replaces public reasoning and the formation of collective judgment with the synchronization of emotion, reason without reasoning. Rather than representative democracy, what we have then is presentative democracy. Not representative, but presentative. Democracy that's mediated by technologies which appear to us as though they are unmediated. The quote-unquote live event of 9/11 or the live event of Greece, for instance, which circumvents our ability to function as citizen subjects who engage in processes of collective reasoning. But maybe that's because the concept of the citizen subject is obsolete. The problem with this, of course, is not that there's more than one reality that is present to us, or that reason is separated from reasoning, but that we've not yet learned how to rethink citizenship after the accident that is proper to it, which is to say, after the synchronization of emotion, like that which today confuses nationalism and post-nationalism, and after the rise of new walls like those of the EU, even while the old nation-states continue to exist, which thereby distort its potential, as well as our perception of its potential. So just to close out, I'll say that an art of knowledge that would transcend the limits of the personal and articulate distinctions of opinion and knowing would today have to start from the perspective of stereo rationality, which is Aurelio's concept, stereo reality, and the concept that I'm kind of building on from that, because in some ways Aurelio can be a bit of a phenomenologist and kind of lack this ability for the abstraction of things like rationality. So I want to mobilize his ideas, but also criticize them and take them in different directions. From the perspective of both stereo reality and stereo rationality, one capable of perceiving both public opinion and public emotion, both reason and reasoning, and in the case of EU, Germany, Greece, both the post-national and the national, without, as Aurelio puts it, falling into glaucoma. And what he means by glaucoma is basically, this would be the result of the accident of virtual technology, which produces a relief effect that causes public emotion to appear as though it were collective judgment, that causes reason to appear as though it's the product of reasoning when it's not, but should be. And that in the case of the EU, Germany, Greece, causes the national to appear as the post-national. Stereo reality and stereo rationality, on the other hand, enable a critical discernment between these binaries. Much as Paolo Uccello introduced perspective into Western visual culture, today we need critical discernment and a resurgence not of blinkered percepts, but of collective concepts capable of enabling the imagination, potentialization, and the realization of alternate futures. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Exactly 15 minutes. Amazing. Amazing. Exactly 15 minutes. Yeah, it's just perfect, like utilization of time. Okay, so we lost Adam because Adam had to leave because just like things got shuffled around and Adam had some studio visits to do and he was like, if I stick around for this, I'm gonna like screw up 6 persons' time. So I think we're left with Rijin and Keith, but because Rijin's not here, I think we should just do Keith and hopefully Rijin show up, and if not, then it's good. So Keith, are you ready? I hope you're ready, Keith. Hey, here we go.
Hey Jason, thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.
Hopefully some questions will come after Keith, but I think we should just like let Keith. You want to introduce Keith or should I go?
Introduce Keith.
You introduce Keith.
Because I'm making you do this today.
Even though we all like.
So we've all been sitting here for about 5 hours, Keith, so no problem, but it better be entertaining. I took it out already. Yeah. So I'm pleased to invite Keith Tilford. I can because you're in the room. Is a visual artist and writer living in New York, whose recent projects have explored themes from science fiction, architecture, geology, and histories of abstraction. He's contributed artwork to Urbanomics philosophy journal Collapse, and his writing has appeared in Design Ecologies. His research interests include theories of alienation in relation to artistic practice, philosophy of technology, philosophy of mathematics, and more broadly, the intersections between art, politics, science, and philosophy. He is also a co-organizer, along with Mohamed Salami, of the Fixing the Future platform, which you can go online and check out. They have a lot of archived talks. So there you go. Floor is all yours, Keith. So take it over from here.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So thanks for inviting me to speak. I feel like as the last person, I don't know if anyone's going to come in after me, but it feels like a lot of pressure. And then there's also the problem of having to repeat things that have already been said. And I think it won't necessarily be a repeat, but I think there's definitely going to be some overlap, of course, with Mo and Patricia. Also some things that Bassam said, and even some alignment with Julieta, although I'm not sure I'd agree fully with everything that she said. But I wanted to sort of try to address all of the questions and provocations, and just to start with the idea of art as research, or the notion of artistic research, which I think is already embedded within artistic modernism, although we understand something entirely different today from that under the rubric of art as research, or research-based practices, which I think more often than not want to be considered in relation to scientific research and practices and broader epistemic consequences. And there's quite a bit of material out there that's kind of emerged in the last decade, and I haven't read all of it, although it's something I have to contend with for a future project and a future research project, not an art project or art research project. But I want to start with a quote from, I'm going to butcher his name here, probably Ivan Sletmies. It's from an article that doesn't have a date, although I can assume it's maybe 5 years old, called Introduction to Art as Research. And he says, quote, "Art as research should make clear to itself which means are at its disposal, knowledge formations, but should avoid naming a goal or a motivation that reinstalls a new knowledge regime, a theoretical model with a specific use. This does not mean that it acts as a counter-science, but that it points to knowledge being created, either under a larger schema of discourses and systems or relating analytically to these. Against the expansion and appropriation of these regimes, this kind of research is without a field to work within," end quote. And he actually goes on to say, quote, "What is important is to show how art avoids internment in categories that serve a knowledge regime only to be circulated in a program of institutions, identity production, and political economic interests," end quote. No, I don't outright disagree with the entirety of this assessment, since to point to knowledge being created is, I think, different from saying that you're creating it. But often, I think the notion of art as research is connected to a sort of strident rejection of any need for the practitioner to determine specific methodologies, which, as a kind of basic gesture of contemporary transdisciplinary art, often results in pandering to a non-hierarchical space of interpretation, or positions that permit art to be the liberalization of a game whose strategy of refusal lay in its claim to be an authentic form of resistance to determination. So it's sort of like saying, what I'm doing is knowledge, but it's not your knowledge, or it's not that knowledge. Normally, indexing, say, the knowledge of institutions, and it ends up being, therefore, the knowledge of whatever each individual knower takes to be known in relation to works of art. But this leads to a conflation between subjective and objective perspectives that results in trivialities, and these kinds of practices that make a knowledge claim about art and do so by positioning themselves as external to institutional structures, I think are precisely what Suhail Malik has termed anarcho-realism. That is, they uphold escape from something like the artificiality of art within institutions and their artificial mechanisms of knowledge capture, while also affirming that their practices are carried out in a more real location that would be exterior to, as Malik put it, regulated and administered forms of culture and society. So by affirming this evasion as an authentic form of resistance, it's sort of precisely what defines contemporary art in Malik's terms as a metagenre of indeterminacy. And to claim that art is without a field, or that it avoids interminant categories, is already to overemphasize a putative autonomy or liberatory effect, to the extent that it has no place other than in an indeterminate and generic outside or non-place, or that its activity dressed as research is some form of signifying utopia that is not at home in the museum or the gallery, even if it finds its way there for exposition and exhibition. And so sort of like transdisciplinary art practices belong nowhere in particular because they're generically situated or inscribed everywhere. But this desire for the generic is without any real rigorous account of the generic itself. And I think this is a point that has been made already by Amanda Beach in her writings, for instance. And I think another way to understand this is to say that transdisciplinary designates a generic space that contemporary art is too close to see for what it is, but it's also one that it continuously appropriates in an ever-widening scope through a kind of undisciplining in order to articulate its difference from what surrounds it. So it's sort of like there's not just generic art or an art of the generic, but there's genres of the generic. But it remains altogether unclear, I think, how an art that's understood to be resistant as a form of undisciplining of knowledge is, or an asignifying practice is able to produce ruptures within the map of knowledge that do anything to contribute to knowledge production. And I think this is often the case because contemporary art is largely dependent upon a discourse about plasticity and openness, but these maneuvers are perfectly compatible with art's instrumentalization through neoliberal logics that undergird the art world or the world of contemporary art in general. So, for instance, someone like Irit Rogoff asserts that it's an illusion of sharing, and this idea of sharing knowledge has already been mentioned previously, and it's sort of within art, it's an illusion of this that leaves these mechanisms kind of untouched, these forms of containment and separation. But again, for Rogoff, this still entails art as research to be sort of resistant, and she states that, quote, regardless of its instrumentalization by various dominant market strategies, it does provide an effective model for a resistance, one of the few instances, to a normative mainstreaming of academic research at the level of knowledge. Issues of asignification, of not adhering to a single level of meaning, and of singularization of the new relational mode of both subjects and of knowledges are central to such a resistance, end quote. I don't want to comment on that in particular because it'll come out a bit later, but I think one of the more involved studies to have emerged around the idea of art as research is a book from 2005 by, I'm going to butcher some more names here, Mika Hanula, Juha Soranta, and Tara Vaden. It's entitled Artistic Research, Theories, Methods, and Practices. So in this book, they sort of claim to situate their argument within an epistemological, ontological framework that preserves the openness and criticality of art. And their starting point is this, really by now familiar, 10 years later, description of art as unfolding a democracy of experiences or a methodological diversity. But, in their assessment, it's so diverse that no object of culture, no material product or ephemeral transaction can be left out of the purview of artistic research, such that, according to their affirmation of methodological pluralism, that involves a generalization of criticality, art must have access to the totality of experience with the capacity to transit from any experience whatsoever to any experiencing subject whosoever. And since there is, as a consequence, no hierarchy to forms of knowledge, even science ought to be open to being critiqued by art. And this is all premised upon an inevitably contradictory nature of the claims that they say themselves, so works and practices, and, but it ends up really only resulting in a sort of localism of intersubjectivity that's described as characterized by its continuing search for definition and transcendence of borders. Yet if you refuse to consider knowledge to have determinable hierarchies, you're also refusing the intelligibility of structure through an appeal to the proliferation of affect and meaning production in a way that eschews conceptual mediation. And the remaining connection that they make to scientific research is exceptionally weak, since it's one that relies on the novelty value of science being compared to that of art, which must also present its objects from new perspectives. So the authors go on to say that, quote, producing artistic knowledge and research occurs in relation to the location of the knowledge in question, localizing it in discussion, end quote. And there isn't anything that immediately seems disagreeable here, but the notion of artistic knowledge, at least as understood by these authors, I think should be approached with caution and just in general. Because for me it very nearly resembles what Wilfrid Sellards has described as the manifest image, or what I think Mo brought this up during his talk at the opening about this, it being this sort of spontaneous image of the human. But I think what's at issue is how this this manifest image is navigated, and that accounts for whether knowledge is produced or not. But art is neither reducible to this manifest image, nor is it isomorphic with scientific methodologies. And it seems to me that the problem is not so much that of artistic knowledge or of what knowledge does art produce, since it will often only deliver intersubjective kinds of knowing, or advanced forms of knowledge at the level of technique, or say superficial knowledge at the level of materials, as in claims to the significance of process or the ostensible properties of material, which in most instances tends to sort of abjure any real attempt at explaining works of art or what's happening cognitively when they're being produced. And the claim that because we are simply presenting something from a new perspective, that this enables us to both critique science and lay claim to scientific methodologies is I think a bit dubious. Art's refusal of institutions and knowledges in the interest of undisciplining as a sort of freedom from constraints seems misguided to me. Of course, what's still at stake is whether or not art has a power of negation, and I think that it does. But this operation is probably in need of being inverted from whatever counts as a sort of dominant paradigm within contemporary art, which I think Malik's assessment is the most cunning vivisection of. And in his phrasing, it's art needs to turn from a negative affirmation, it's a negative affirmation of institutions rather than an affirmative negation. So, and it's the attachment to the latter, where art is seen as a critical virtue that really prevents the former. And without this recognition, art tends to sort of just pivot interminably around an invisible axis. It ends up without field, without constraint. It's forced to make an overemphasis on the affirmation of research that must make detours, encounters, or failures and face uncertainty. And the problem here is that this kind of uncertainty, when it's valorized, turns art into what Amanda Beach has called a metacritical reflection on its own tragedy. So, the embrace of detours and failures, as might minimally qualify as a kind of risk rationality, but it's the problem is that when you isolate, you can isolate this as an aspect of scientific practice that should be sort of embraced and affirmed, but because it's an exercise in learning along the way to actually producing knowledge, but it's simply a moment in the research process within science, whereas art takes it to be a primary vector that can somehow be a corrective to otherwise valid forms of research, and it ends up fetishizing a delirium of indeterminacy that doesn't adequately grasp the sort of contingency it wants to lay claim to. So the more pressing question for me is of what effects upon knowledge is art able to produce, which is to say, really, what manipulations upon knowledge are afforded through the thought form of art, and how do these ramify? So, while I'm not maybe as interested as, say, the members of Glass Bead in attempting to clone the primary reference within Reza Negarestani's bibliography, for instance, and forcing them to sort of say the word art, I nonetheless completely agree with the principles of their inquiry, and I think that I would align myself with the same questions that they're concerned with, namely, what type of agency does art have within rationality, and how is it that art is not simply reflective of the other of reason, given that reasoning is a necessary component to having a transformative engagement with the world. So, for instance, two members of Glass Bead, Ida Soulard and Fabien Giraud, have an essay that just was recently published called The Morphostratum, Contribution to a Theory of Sights, and there they affirm that, quote, art is not merely a conservation of what we were or a relation to what we are, but a proper commitment to what we could be. It is the material formalization of the possible, end quote. Now, I think this is sort of an exceptionally dense claim, since art is certainly not ethics, and it falters, I think, in terms of its capacity to adjudicate how things could be or ought to be. But this proposition, I think, is informed largely by Negarestani and Ray Brassier's reading of Sellers, as the authors sort of openly admit. And I kind of want to turn to Negarestani's reading of Sellers for a minute, because for him, Sellers' idea of the scientific image is that which it introduces revision to the manifest image through, as he puts it, an ever-deepening investigation of structures by placing constraints on the functional autonomy of the manifest. And I think by functional autonomy of the manifest, we can read the same as the idea of the democracy of experiences qua art or something like that. And the idea here is that it introduces a stereoscopic view that acts as the integration of the scientific and manifest towards their consequential self-construction. And he sort of affirms these transformative processes of rationality to modify basically the orientations of how we encounter ourselves in the world. And Reza Nagarstani says, quote, "The scientific unbinding of the intelligibility of a world outside of the manifest image should be taken as a vector of transformation for cognitive inquiry, one that unilaterally forces thought to change its structure and rules in order to be intelligible both at the level of internal configuration and at the level of purpose," end quote. So in other words, it's the scientific image that is sort of counterintuitive and alien to the spontaneous image, self-image of the human. And the common critical assessment of art here is that it merely affirms and upholds this manifest or spontaneous image. And I think the main thing to keep in mind is that art does not really possess the same power to unbind the intelligibility of our world as science does. But this does not mean that it doesn't play a role in this. Moreover, I think it should be stressed that that art ought to take its cues from scientific understandings rather than attempt to carve out the claim to some dimension of reality to which it alone has access. It's because they have a relation, which even Zalamea notes. He sort of refers to it as a relay, where art is and he borrows this from Fossalon. Art is a form that signifies itself, and science is a structure that forms itself. And I think that's one of the ways in which we can begin to understand creativity in relation to scientific rationality and artistic practices. But I think that it's difficult work. And I've been attempting recently to try to think about how artworks and the methodological concerns of art practice can be viewed as a form of model construction. And I know Bassam was also talking about this a bit, in terms of like how do we leave contemporary art by leaving behind composition in favor of model? And I think this is this is a fascinating place to sort of think about what the future practices of art, or what how art now can be actually adequate to things that are happening in the present, is by trying to understand what models do and how they function. And my reason for trying to do this is because in science, models are used to sort of assess and organize complex sets of information, and it takes abstractions or collections of unobservables and tries to render them intelligible without this being reducible to sort of at least within art of the material visibility of invisibilities, which is sort of Badou's understanding of what art does. And I think the same question that we might ask about models is the same that we ought to ask about art, and that's how do they study, detect, measure, or reconstruct complex organizations that are not at the level of the manifest. So, and models they're sort of necessarily constrained to a set of abstract principles. This is Margaret Morrison's interpretation of them, and they transit between these abstract principles and the empirical world, mediating between them as kind of technologies of investigation. So, this is one way to think of art as a kind of form of investigation rather than research, and also as a technology. And but I think to provide an adequate answer to what this question is it's first necessary to kind of recognize art as not being outside in some more authentic reality, but it's rather an artificial institutional practice. And it's artificial in the same way that cognition itself is already a form of artifice and artificiality. So take, for instance, the neuroscientific perspective of Alain Bertholdt, who sees the brain as a sort of simulation engine, or Metzinger's idea of the self being a computational device. And this sort of leads me into another part of the provocations, which I think were probably, I'm guessing, Mo's, that had to do about what can art and artificial intelligence do for each other? Is there an ungoverned and free art in the episteme of the algorithm? My intuition here is that no, because the nature of computation introduces constraints, and algorithms don't produce works of art without established constraints. The recent fascination with Google's deep dream neural networks is, I think, evidence of this. And the network can only focus on particular things, and it will turn any image into a kind of gooey mix of slug puppies, whether it's a a tree, a sunset, or somebody's anus, and we collectively recognize these outputs as having artistic merit, but it very quickly is collapsed into kitsch, and it sort of occupies the same cultural space as fractal posters on dorm room walls. But I think that it's how are we to engage with this episteme of the algorithm that I think is really going to determine how art relates to knowledge in the future. And I think that this was already something that the New Tendencies movement was trying to address. So, for instance, Julio Carlo Argan, who was a historian and critic writing in 1965 around members of this movement, said something like very similar, even though this was 50 years ago, to things that we hear today. And he says, quote, "The idea of art as research emerges when art is no longer firmly based in a system of knowledge. However, knowledge itself is no longer considered a closed and unitary system, but rather a set of instances of research carried out using different methodological criteria in different areas." And maybe I can skip over some stuff to kind of get to, Abraham Moles, who was another person associated with New Tendencies and worked alongside Max Bentz to sort of develop the idea of information aesthetics, following the early cybernetic theories and the work of C.S. Peirce. And he sort of viewed experimentation not as some free, free from constraint sort of thing. It was the opposite of autonomous creative freedoms, because for him it's a form of study that was defined by constraining laws or an algorithm. And this is also from a text written in 1968 where he considered this to be a revolution of artificial thought, where it was important to see that this was more important than the mechanized revolution of Marx. And was changing the way that artists related to their materials. There's an interesting quote from him here. He says, quote, "The artist no longer directly touches or manipulates color, material, or objects. He or she manipulates algorithms, which are more or less abstract. He or she must necessarily learn how to handle this abstraction. This gives rise to a problem in the education of the artists themselves. Before these artists may possibly become, if not educators, at least agents of development in general society. The role of the artist appears at the moment to be to construct algorithms or programs for the systematic exploration of a field of possibilities defined by a certain number of constraints that constitute one of the definitions of functionality, one of the fundamental doctrines of the creation of objects for the whole of society." Now, he, of course, had a specific idea of what he thought art was, writing in 1968 around, these people who are, were either directly programmers toying around with aesthetics, or were artists, working directly with programmers, or artists learning how to program, etc. And some of them didn't even consider themselves artists, and the larger mainstream art world, it took a while for them to sort of recognize the validity of what they were doing. But, and of course, designing and toying with algorithms might have a sort of a much different kind of meaning or definition than he gave it. But I think that whether we're going to choose to call whatever that is art or not, I mean, it's this really has to be something that is separated from contemporary art understood as a kind of civic virtue, which is just basically Malik's assessment of contemporary art as a sort of totalizing logic. And instead think about it. Yeah?
Yeah. Go ahead, just
yeah, I'm just going
to... we're getting cues that
we're very strict, and you're over the 15 minutes now.
Leave the institution soon, actually.
Yeah, because we're 48 minutes ahead of time, overtime, but...
So, okay, just to finish, I mean, I just want to say that, I'm not interested in how art produces knowledge, because I don't think that art does theory. I don't, I think it can be put to use by theory. I think theory can put art to use. But I think what functionally it is a set of procedures for the manipulation of form and material that sort of, allows for cognition to gain traction upon knowledges and rationality, that that's its knowledge effect. And this is something that even Althusser understood. So, I mean, for a cognitive neuroscientist like Merlin Donald, for instance, art is sort of, it's the technology-driven practice of cognitive engineering, and I think that this is kind of a way that we need to understand art as a sort of technology of investigation, rather than some sort of universally transit across global levels of discourse and knowledge and produce its own knowledge at any given place and time is just a bit misleading. And I think the last thing that I wanted to mention was this idea that Nagarastani has of cognitive catastrophes, because there was this provocation about the end times, right? And like I think understanding cognitive catastrophe is something that the scientific image does. It's like a catastrophe of the non-manifest. So when rationality reaches into the world as we sort of spontaneously understand it and deracinates the subject, this is a way for thought to reorient itself in the world. And I think that art is one way of sort of engineering catastrophes for thought. And this is what enables knowledge to be produced. It's not itself a form of producing knowledge. That's it.
Thank you, Keith. In the midst of the chaos and the prolongation of the program, we lost 2 of our presenters. So deep apologies to both Adam and Rijin. But hopefully we can get there.
Those who expected to hear them.
Yes. Yeah, and those who expected to hear them. So like hopefully we managed to get their presentation somehow and add it to the archive or like the papers that will come out of this.
If they would be so generous.
They are, and they will.
I feel very bad now.
Anyways, thanks to everyone for being with us for this length of time. We're 50 minutes over our scheduled time. So, and
we're gonna go from here and jump directly into the river.
Totally.
And the river here is nice and cool. It's an alpine river, so that's gonna help.
So I don't think,
this long time.
even though we made people wait, I don't think there's any time for question answer.
No, let's have the archive.
Yeah, people need to go home.
Once we have the archive, we can open, the comments and like start developing conversation in different form.
So apologies to you guys because that's of no fault of your own, and you prepared so many amazing things. But,
and if you know how excruciating it was to sit in the heat all day indoors, but we had planned this to happen today, and we had to really do it and go through with it. So thank you for being with us.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Yes, thanks.
Thank you.
Lovely. I'm gonna stop the broadcast.